Okay, well, good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever people happen to be. I know for me it's morning here, but not too early. It's 8 a.m. here in Regina, Saskatchewan, Canada. So hello from Canada to all the people around the world who are, it's exciting to see all the people who are interested in the platform that I've been using and have been kind of really passionate about over the last 10 years or so. So it's really great to see such an audience for what at one point was a very niche product, but becoming a lot more mainstream right now. So that's really cool. Okay, my session today is on Power Apps Portal's ALM, application lifecycle management. I'll get more into the definition of what we'll be covering today because that is a relatively broad term. But at a high level, we're talking about how do we move, we do our work in dev, hopefully in a dev environment of Dataverse, and how do we then take those changes and move them across to other environments? How can that be integrated into pipelines, that sort of thing? All right, let's go through here. All right, quick introduction. Again, my name is Nicholas Hayduk. I'm the president and software engineer with Engineered Code Consulting, Inc., a Microsoft MVP, and I've been using the Power Apps Portals product essentially since the beginning. My career started with ADX Studio, which, if you don't know the history, ADX Studio was the company that actually built Power Apps Portals way back in the day. And was acquired by Microsoft in 2015. So Microsoft acquired what was then known as ADX Studio Portals and renamed it a couple times since then, which has now become Power Apps Portals. But if you're ever looking at kind of the tables that sit behind the Power Apps Portals, you'll see that they're all ADX underscore, and that comes from the name of the company, ADX Studio, back in the day. So if you haven't already, feel free to connect with me on LinkedIn. I do have a Twitter feed. I've got a blog, which isn't as active these days, but we do have a very active YouTube channel. We put out a video every week on Tuesdays with just some random kind of roughly 2-minute tip on all these different things Power Portals related. Also have a podcast that I've done with Nick Dolman as well. So that's Refresh the Cache. So if you're interested in a podcast related to Power Apps Portals, that's an option as well. So yeah, please connect with me on any of those channels if you want to get more Portals content. And all right, moving on. Let's look at the agenda. So as I mentioned, we'll cover very quickly kind of what is ALM. What are we covering in today's session? Why is it hard for Power Apps Portals? It's, unfortunately with Power Apps Portals and ALM, you'd hope that there would just be a nice button that says deploy this to, another environment. Especially if you're kind of familiar with how to move solutions across with your metadata, so moving your tables and your fields and all that sort of stuff across. Unfortunately, with Power Apps Portals, it's not that simple. We'll then get into a relatively large list of your options. So one thing you'll learn is that there is no one single option. Even from Microsoft, they've got a couple options that they're recommending, different kind of flavors of the week. But there are a lot of different ways that you can accomplish this. And a lot of it will probably depend on what existing skill sets do you have and how can you take advantage of what you already know how to do to move it across. And then we'll just kind of cover some of the challenges that we've run into with ALM and how, to be honest, at this point, it's still not possible to have, a 100% completely automated ALM process, depending on what your requirements are. So we'll talk about some of those. But the good news is Microsoft is trying to address those. So we'll talk about that then. I guess if anyone has any questions, are we just kind of doing that in the chat? Cheryl, is that kind of how we're handling that?
Generally, we ask people to post in the chat, and then it's up to you, Nick, whether we interrupt you or if you want to break for questions as you go through, or whether you'd like to handle them at the end.
Yeah, if you want to interrupt me, that's fine. I do like to take them kind of as I go, but sometimes I just don't stare at I'm not looking at the chat. So yeah, if there's any questions, feel free to jump in and interrupt me. I don't mind that.
Okay, I'll try to hop in. Hop in at the right time.
I've got the chat open here, so I'll try and pay attention over there as well. But I don't know if anyone want to listen to me talk straight for an hour. So it's usually kind of fun to answer questions throughout. Okay. Next slide. So, what is ALM? That's kind of the question we've got to answer before we describe how we're going to do it for Power Apps portals. So, ALM, Application Lifecycle Management. As I mentioned, it's a very broad concept. There's lots of things that people could consider in there. So I don't want to get into a terminology discussion about whether we've covered all of ALM. I mean, the short answer is we're not. Really, what we're covering today is really about moving our work between environments like dev, test, UAT, prod, that sort of thing. So within Dataverse, the work that you do in general is contained within the Dataverse environment, or if you're doing things like companion apps, maybe there's other external resources as well. But the idea is that hopefully you have your dev instance, which has all of the different resources, and then when you're moving to upstream environments like test or UAT and prod, that you have copies, you have a similar setup that requires you to move the work you've done in dev to those upstream environments. So that's really what we're going to be looking at today, is how do we take the work that we've done in a development environment and push that up to upstream environments. Now, what I'm not going to be covering today is things like Azure pipeline, like DevOps pipelines, get into the specifics of those types of things. We're going to be covering how you can get those into your DevOps pipelines, and we'll talk about how you can do that. But in terms of actually setting up one of those, we're not going to cover that because we're going to be talking about the different techniques, and we'll kind of tell you which ones kind of can be plugged into automated pipelines, that sort of thing. But I'm not going to be showing any of those today. We're going to be mostly talking about what are the steps that you could integrate into a pipeline. Okay, so why is this not just a simple two-minute session? If we were talking about moving the table definitions between environments, if we could just not talk about managed versus unmanaged, beyond that, it would be probably a pretty simple conversation. You export your solution and you import into your target environment. And it would be a pretty quick session on how to move those types of things between environments. Again, you can talk about unpacking and, where do you, manage versus unmanaged, all those types of things. But portals is kind of another level of complexity. At least I find it's another level of complexity on top of that. And why is that? Because we're not talking about just solutions. And in fact, we might not be talking about solutions at all. And today we will not be talking about solutions because I'm going to make the assumption that if you're already working in Dataverse, you probably already know how to move solutions across. So whether you're doing that in an automated form, an automated way or not, we're not going to cover that today. Not saying that that's not an important part of a portal's ALM process, but there's not really much specific to portals in that particular case. The key to know is that when you do move things as part of your ALM process, you should be, I'm not sure if there's any exceptions to this, but you got to move the solutions first. So all the stuff we're talking about is once you've moved the solutions, what then do you do to move the rest of the stuff? And the reason that portals is complicated is that you need to move data and not just metadata. So most of what you do in a Power Apps portal implementation is actually data within your Dataverse database and not schema that gets moved over as part of solutions. So when we talk about creating lists and forms and permissions, all those things are just creating records in the database. So when you export a solution, none of that gets included. So that's really probably the most complex part of this, is that we're not talking about just exporting some tables. We're talking about actually exporting the data from your Dataverse environment and moving that between environments. The other thing is that the data model is complex. We're not talking about one or two different entities here or tables. We're talking, in some case, dozens. There's pages and websites and permissions and basic forms and lists and advanced forms and for metadata. And I mean, there's a lot, content snippets, site settings. There is a whole lot of tables that are related to the ALM, that could be related to the ALM process. So it's not just as simple as, oh, I'll just export this one table to a spreadsheet and import it into the destination environment. There's a lot of data, and the data is very cyclical. So you have data that points to other data. So that points to other table and then kind of comes back. So for example, we got web pages, which you can have a lookup to a list on it. And those lists can then point to web pages. So if you were to just say your technique was, I'm just going to export this table to Excel and then import it in a destination environment. Well, do you do web pages first or do you lists first? Either way you do it, you're going to end up with dependencies where you import your web pages, you're missing the lists. You import the lists first, you're missing the web pages. So the data is very cyclical. Again, advanced forms point to steps, which then point back to advanced forms. So there's lots of cyclical data in there. And so just a simple, I'm going to export the records and import the records using Excel, for example, isn't going to cut it, unfortunately. So for all these reasons, it's a little bit more complicated. And I find, honestly, that the ALM process, because what we do is we work with a lot of partners and help them with their portals implementations. And a lot of times we'll get brought in, say, halfway through a project when the partner says, hey, we need to take this project, we need to do a few more advanced things that maybe aren't in our wheelhouse. So they'll bring us in and we'll help them do a few more things. And they'll say, okay, great. Where's the button to push this to the production? And we're like, yeah, no, there's no button. This is when we do even our most basic implementations. This is one of the the bigger parts of the project is how do we move these between environments. So unfortunately, there is no easy button, but we will talk about some of the options that we've used. I'm seeing some questions here. A question for the end: what's your preferred method for building internal hyperlinks in Liquid? I've caused myself a lot of headaches in the early days, hard coding the base URL for my portal, which of course difference between the source and the destination environment. I'm trying to think of a case where you would need to, like, in those cases, it's all about relative URLs versus absolute URLs are your friend. So if you're doing anything in JavaScript that calls back to the say the web API, all of those can be done using relative URLs. So the only places where we get into like internal hyperlinks where we need to know the full URL would be like invitation codes. And so what we find is that the website record itself does have a the website record has a URL on it that can be updated to your custom domain. So when necessary, we will pull from that environment or from the website record and ensure that the custom domain is set up there appropriately. So there is a field in Dataverse that does contain that information. So we'll pull from there. It's not pretty, but again, as much as possible, avoiding directly referring to a URL there by using relative URLs whenever possible. Yeah, I see a comment here about sites, putting sites in Liquid. That's another option as well. That's a little bit more explicit and probably easier to deal with. So yeah. Okay, so I got a question here that says, can you please elaborate on the first point, need to move records, not just solutions? So probably best to just demonstrate this with an example. Let me bring up my thing here. So if we look at portal. So this is the portal management app for one of my sample portals that I have here. When we look at, say, a web page, web pages are records in the database. They are not things that you modify with solutions. The web page table is obviously a table that can be moved across with solutions, but the actual records within there, so the actual pages on your portal, are data within Dataverse. So when you go to export a solution, exporting solutions do not include any of the data in your environment. So we have to look at, we have the tables. The tables, so for example, the web page table gets installed when you install the portal in your environment automatically by Microsoft. And that will include, when you install that portal, it will include all kind of the basic template that you pick. So let's say you're using the starter portal. When you install that in your, say, production environment, you'll get the plain vanilla out of the box portal records. However, as part of your implementation, you're probably creating new pages. You're probably creating new basic forms. Maybe you're creating lists. These records, so you'll see here, I've got 3 forms right now. Those are records in the database, and when you export a solution, you get no records from your database. You just get the metadata about your database. So somehow you need to export these records that contain the definition of what your forms look like. Now, these forms, as an example, these basic forms will point to a form that's within your solution. And so that's why I mentioned earlier, it's always important that you move the solutions over first, then you can move over your data, which then refers to those forms. But nothing that exists currently within the solutions would allow you to export these rows from the database as part of a solution export. So hopefully that kind of clears up that point. Okay, so let's look at what the options are. And this is obviously not an exhaustive list of options. It is just a list of options that we've either heard people using or we use ourselves. So kind of, here's at least, what do we have here? 7 different options. So what we've got are, there's a couple XRM toolbox plugins or tools. We've got the portal record mover or the portal configuration deployer. We can use tools like KingswaySoft or Scribe. KingswaySoft is an SSIS, SQL Server Integration Services, I believe, package. And that's another way to move data between environments, often used for doing things like integrations. But you can think of going from dev to test to prod as an integration between those 3 types of environments. So we've seen people use those tools. There's the configuration migration utility. That is a tool directly from Microsoft that is meant for moving configuration type data, which this is, between environments. And for a long time, that was the Microsoft's preferred method. There's also, you can use package deployer, which kind of ties into the configuration migration utility to deploy your data between environments. There's Microsoft's latest option, which is the Power Apps CLI, or the command line interface. And then there's always custom code. So those are the options that we're going to look at today. And we'll kind of go through what are the pros and cons of some of these options. So let's start off with the portal records mover. So this was done, created by Tanguy, who is the guy who actually wrote the XRM toolbox itself. So this was, for a very long time, the method that a lot of people were using. This was the kind of the de facto standard for many years before some of the newer options came out, especially at the beginning when the portals implementations were relatively basic and people needed to move their data between environments. It is a very easy tool to use. Essentially what it does is it allows you to produce XML. So you connect to your environment, you say, here are the records I want to export. You click a button, it exports it as an XML package, and then you can then import that to another environment, and so it kind of copies over. Excuse me. The code that Tanguy has written handles the cyclical nature of the data. So that's kind of the nice thing. It handles, web pages that point to lists and all that sort of stuff. So it's done. The tool was built specifically to handle the kind of the complex nature of the of the data. Now, it is all or nothing kind of per entity, although it does handle notes well. So one of the challenges that we had from the outset with these tools was the fact that web files in your Power Apps portals, web files in your Power Apps portals use notes, the annotation record type in Dataverse to store the actual files that are shown on the portal. And so what that meant is that if you wanted to say export all the notes, that was in general a bad idea, because you probably had a bunch of notes that were completely unrelated to portal in your dev environment that you didn't want to move as part of your ALM process. So Tanguy's tool did a very good job of only including the notes related to the things that you cared about. One of the downsides to it, though, and one of the reasons that we moved away from it, is that it can't be used for custom entities. So there's a very specific list of portals-related entities that it's used for. We find that in our implementations, often there's custom entities that we're bringing in. So it's really meant for kind of more basic, out-of-the-box type portal implementations. It also is, because it's part of the XRM toolbox, can't be scripted unless, and I think Jim is next, I believe. He's either before me or next, but I think he might be next. So you can ask him all about his portals records mover console app. But essentially what Jim did was he took the code from Tangi and made it into a console application. So kind of the official XRM Toolbox tool was more of a manual process where you opened up the XRM Toolbox, you did your import export. Wasn't something that could be scripted, but Jim did create a console version of it, so something to be aware of. Let's just see here, checking in on the questions. Yes, we have some answers about the partial URLs. Yeah, we've talked about the base URL. Can you? So for source control, when deploying to client environments, we started using Pack Portal to download the portal deployment. It also has an option to exclude site settings and do incremental deployment. Yeah, so that's going to be the Power Apps CLI. So yeah, we will definitely, thanks Pete for kind of mentioning, he's got a tool for that as well. He's got a visual, VS Code extension. So we will be getting to the Power Apps CLI as one of the two kind of official versions from Microsoft. Okay, what I want to do is just quickly show what the portal's record mover looks like in real life. So here's an example of, I've connected to my environment. You can see here all the record types that are typically related to a portal. So in this case, let me just grab, we'll say entity lists. Oh, we got the new names in here, list. So I could check whichever ones I want. I could check everything, not check everything. We can filter based on a specific website. Now, in this case, I just have a starter portal. We can add some filtering. So this is useful for saying, oh, I only want to move the stuff I've changed in the last week. So you can do a modified or created on or before certain dates, only get active records, and you can change the way that it exports. So you can say export as a folder structure or as a zip. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to run this. I'm going to say retrieve records. So we can see I have a single list here. For fun, let's just include a basic form as well. Do that, retrieve records. So now I've got these basic forms and the lists. Now that I've run my query, I can say export records. I'm going to go to there, going to go to there, and I'm going to go XRM tool. Let's just call it portal records mover. And we click save. So now we've got this XML file that I will bring up over here. So we got this portal records mover. I'm going to just edit this in Notepad, and you'll see that what it's done is it's exported these records, the data related to them in this kind of key value pair format, which is just the way that the serialization of those entities work. Then the idea is once I've exported, I can then go back to the XRM toolbox, and then I can say import. Now I can also just skip the kind of export import, and I can just do a direct transfer if that's what I want to do as well. Now, separate from the ALM process, but also tied in, you can consider, some people would probably consider part of the ALM process, is about having the work that you've done in backed up somewhere in source control. That's a very important point for us. We want to make sure that there's, sometimes people do things that they're not supposed to in environments. We find sometimes the editors are a little wonky and can clear out your stuff, and you save it, you lose all that thing. So it's very important that the work that you do is backed up somewhere, and we like to use Azure DevOps for that, using Git repositories. So any of these things that we talk about exporting, this XML file, for example, what we'll do is then we'll take that and check that into source control, so that if something were to ever happen where we lose, you spend days and days working on a web template and someone accidentally deletes it, then you've got your backup. So it's important that any of these processes that we use generate some sort of file, list of files, whatever it is, that we can use to back up and then have a copy of our portal. So not only do we use these processes to move from one environment to other, but we also use it to save our work, so that in case of tragedy, it will we've got a solution there and a backup of it. So again, this tool is very easy to use. Not a ton of configuration options here. We got the options here. So if you're working on a kind of a basic portal and you just want something really simple to go from point A to point B, this is a great tool. And like I said, it was used for years and years, and on basic implementations, it works very well. So that's the XRM Toolbox tool portal records mover. Okay, getting back to next one. So there's also another XRM Toolbox tool called the Portal Configuration Deployer. In this one, you can select the source and target environments. The uniqueness of records is based on the ADX_name field. You do have the ability to map between different target environments. This tool is, similar in concept to the one I just showed you. To be honest, it's not a tool that I've really used before, but it is another option out there. So if for whatever reason the portal records mover doesn't get you what you need for whatever reason, it's something that you can consider looking at as an alternative, because maybe this does include whatever feature it is you need. So there is this second tool that is along the same lines as the other one from Tangi. So a couple tools in the XRM toolbox specifically designed to help you with your portal's ALM process. Okay, next one here, Kingsway Soft or Scribe or any of these other data integration migration tools. So if you have experience with other data integration tools, if you're experienced with SSIS, if you know Scribe because of all the data integration projects you've done, in theory, you could look at things like Azure Data Factory, or, there's all these different tools out there that are meant for synchronizing data between environments or migrating data between environments. Those are an option here. I mean, the Dataverse SDK, we've got the connectors for Power Automate. In theory, you could probably write a Power Automate to move your stuff across. I don't know if I'd recommend it, but you could. So just keep in mind that these other tools that you may already know for moving data are an option with Power Apps portals as well. So if that's something that you already are an expert in Kingsway Soft, it's an option to look at using Kingsway Soft and SSIS integration packages to move things across. So again, remember, it's just data. It's just rows in the database. Again, you have to be concerned about the complex, cyclical nature, that sort of thing. But if you've got those skill sets already, those are options that you can look at as well. Okay, just checking for questions here. I don't see any questions at the moment. So moving on, we're now moving into really the two main options that Microsoft presents. So the configuration migration utility. This, for a long time, was Microsoft's official and only official answer for moving Power Apps portals between environments. For a long time, even though it was the official answer, it wasn't something that we used because of the notes thing that I talked about earlier, and I'll talk about why about that in a second. But for a long time, this has been just what's going on here? Just gonna grab this URL here. So for a long time, it was Microsoft's kind of only official answer. Now, a couple of years ago, Microsoft did an update to the configuration migration utility that I feel made it actually the official answer. So what happened before was that when you chose to include a record type when moving things across, so again, we'll use the notes example. If you said, hey, I want to move notes, which is really important if you're moving web files, it would extract all the notes from your system. Again, that is probably not good. You probably have a bunch of notes in your system because it is a related table. It's not just the web files, it's the related annotations table. You probably have a ton of notes in your system that have nothing to do with portals. So you wouldn't want to move all of the notes from your dev environment to your upstream environments. Now, I know that some people, what they would do is they would do the export and then they would process the XML files that are produced by that export and remove those. But this still slowed things down. It still had to export all these notes and then you have to kind of strip them out. yourself. What Microsoft introduced a couple years ago was you can include a fetch XML filter as part of the definition of which tables you want. So you could say, for example, I want to get the annotation table, but I only want to get annotations that are related to web files. And that made the process extremely more, like it made it a possibility for us in our mind, rather than having to export a whole bunch of stuff and then write tools to strip it out. That was just kind of built into the tool. So the configuration migration utility is a tool directly from Microsoft. So it's an official tool that Microsoft provides. It is essentially a Windows application that you can download and install. It's part of there's a NuGet package for it. Think of it as part of kind of the SDK tools like plugin registration, configuration migration utility, these different tools that Microsoft provides. So it's an official tool from Microsoft. And the idea is that it's meant specifically for moving configuration between environments. So it's not meant as a data migration utility. It's meant primarily for configuration type records. So a good example would be, let's say you create a custom table for capturing countries, provinces, and cities. Often you would create those in your dev and you'd want to have those same cities, often with the exact same IDs for those records or for those rows, because you may have code that depends on those IDs being the same in all those environments. So the configuration migration utility does that. So it allows you to export, similar to what the XRM Toolbox tool does. It basically exports into XML. In this case, they do a zip file because there's multiple files in there, but it allows you to export those files or export those records to XML and then import those records into a target environment. So similar process, but the thing with the configuration migration utility is that it is a bit more flexible in terms of you can define specifically which tables you want. You can define which attributes or which columns on those tables that you want. And as I just mentioned, you can include fetch XML to include only the rows that you are interested in. So with that, you are able to define, they call it the schema file. So you define your schema file. Here are the tables. Here are the rows. Here are the columns I want to export. Run the tool. It exports a zip file that contains all those records, and then you take that and then you import that into your target environment. And then if those records already exist, it will update them, all based on the IDs of those records. Okay, so now one of the reasons that this was Microsoft's official answer is that they actually gave you schema files, so starter schema files for all of these for all the different portal types. Let me see if I can get this link up here. Grab it right here. So you can see that they actually provide the schema files for the different templates that they provide. So if you want to move a partner portal, open that up. We got this. And here's your schema file that defines all the different, all the different entities, fields, columns, all that sort of stuff that are involved in a partner portal. Now, in our experience, we don't generally use these. We find that this is a lot of data. A lot of it's probably not being used. And so we prefer to try and keep things as minimal as possible. So we typically, and just so you know, right now, this is our preferred method. At this point, we use the configuration migration tool for our ALM processes. So what we do is we like to just kind of basically start from scratch. Now, we have kind of a much smaller file that we start from. So because, I mean, pretty much everything requires web pages and entity lists and forms and that sort of thing. So we find that these ones are a little bloated, like they're just really big. They cover everything. They're meant to be a starting point and to take things out of it. So we have our kind of own versions that we start from that are quite a bit more minified. So let me just jump back here. So they provide us those XML files, but again, we tend to kind of create our own. One of the tricks that or tips that we like to share about this is, especially with defining those fetch XML filters, we like to have we like to move the fewest number of rows as possible. So for example, when we're moving web pages, if we haven't touched a bunch of the web pages, so for example, the page not found, if we haven't touched the page not found, we would prefer to exclude that from our ALM process. It makes the file smaller, it makes the process faster, and it means kind of less clutter within our source control. Because again, we take the files that are exported from here and actually check those into source control, and we'll talk about that in a second. But we like to have kind of only move the things that we've actually changed. So one of the things we do is we use naming conventions for things like web templates. So we'll often just start all of our custom web templates with some sort of prefix, usually client specific. So for example, if we were building something for engineered code, we'd probably say EC. So all of our custom web templates would start with EC dash something. That way, then we can write in our fetch XML that says, get me all the web templates that I've kind of modified. I can just say, get me all the ones that start with EC dash. And then that way, we don't have to worry about updating our schema file if we're sticking to our conventions. The only time we have to update our schema file is when we update one of the ones that are out of the box, which we typically target by name. So when we're looking at, say, web templates, we will generally have a fetch XML query that says, give me all the ones that start with the customer's specific prefix or that have these specific names, and then we'll just kind of manually keep track of which web templates, which out-of-the-box web templates we may have updated. So we find that to be very, very, very efficient in that using that convention means it's easier for us to keep track of what we've changed, and it really reduces the size of the exports that we get, keeps our source control simpler, and it makes the process when you're moving records faster because it's not having to export and import records that have not changed. The other thing to know is that this process is completely scriptable, including within, there are PowerShell commandlets that you can use to call this. So you have to define your schema. The schema is kind of the first step. You define your schema, but then after you've defined your schema, the import-export process or export-import process is something that can be completely scripted. There's also tools within Whale Hamzy's Azure DevOps tasks to do imports and exports using those things. So when we're talking about adding these things to an Azure DevOps pipeline, once you've created your schema file, it is pretty straightforward. There's a command where you can just say, I want to import, or I want to export from this thing, and I want to import over there. So it makes it pretty simple. Okay, just checking the questions here. Power Apps CLI, which we'll talk about. Configuration migration has worked well in the past, but painful environments where I'm working with multiple portals in the same environment. A lot of effort to configure filters for every single configure entity to see which website you're deploying. Yes, keeping that schema file up to date is probably the most challenging part of using the configuration migration utility. If you don't do that, and there's really no kind of automated way of doing that. It's just a process that, internally we kind of say, hey, if you're doing anything, make sure that everything is included in there. Now, the other thing we do is we then take, when you export using the configuration migration utility, you get a zip file. We then take that file and we don't just check in the zip file in the source control. We actually take that and we unzip it and unpack it, similar to what people do with solutions, where they take the zip file for the solution and they actually unpack it into all the resources, which makes it much nicer in source control. So that allows us to actually go through pull request procedures with our portal's configuration. So when people are making changes, part of the process is I've made my changes, now I've got to submit a pull request for it. That allows us to identify, oh, wait, I changed this, but why don't I see this in my pull request? So it's another opportunity for people to ensure that the work they've done is getting checked into source control. But I do agree that the management of the schema file is probably the most difficult part of this process. I see a comment here about the Power Apps CLI can be used seamlessly in Azure DevOps pipelines as well. I've got a question about the schema file. Yeah, basically a comment saying is there a way to automate or easier way to create it? Again, the only tip I have there is about the naming convention. Just come up with that naming convention so then you only have to modify. Really, you only have to modify the schema file when you are updating an existing content snippet, web template, page template, that sort of thing. But if you create new ones, if you follow that naming convention, they'll already be considered as part of that schema. I'm using Capgemini release and build extension from last 2 years to export the portal data, including custom entity and source control. Deploy. Okay. Capgemini. That's not a tool I'm familiar with, but I'll take a look. That looks cool. Power Platform CLI, including deployment file, looks promising and may be a way forward. And then, yeah, so we'll talk about the Power App CLI here in a second. Okay, I just wanted to just quickly show you a little bit how this process works with a configuration migration utility. So it's really, there's 3 things you can do in this tool. Once you download it, you run the executable. The main thing is create schema. So I'm going to connect to my environment. Get in there. It's going to select my default solution here. And just as a simple quick test here, I'm going to say fields for, I'm going to change my entity here. This is my full list of entities that I can pick between. And I'm just going to, for fun, select basic form. And I'm just going to export, say, the name. I can say add entity. I've got the fields. Oh, I want to remove entity. I just want to add the fields. So I got basic form, and now I'm just exporting the name. What I can then also do is I can configure import settings. And as I mentioned, you can use fetch XML to filter records. So I could paste in my fetch XML here to only include certain records. Another important step is that when you're doing this, in any of the portal, any of the ADX_ entities, disable the plugins. There are a significant number of plugins specifically around the web page records that will cause you all sorts of headaches if you don't disable plugins. So make sure you are disabling plugins when you do this. I like this button right here, disable plugins on all entities for import. It's almost never the case where we need those plugins to run. So if you just do that, that's great. And I'm just going to click save. So what this will do is I can say file, save schema. I'm just going to call this schema.xml. I've saved my schema. I'm now going to go over to my thing. So I've got my schema.xml, edit, and you'll see that this is a very basic schema for what I've got here. It's saying, oh, I want the entity form and the fields here. Now, once you've done this a few times, we often are just editing the file directly in XML if we need to add or remove attributes. The UI is really nice, but I mean, it's probably faster just to add attribute names in here. It is pretty quick. So we're often just kind of editing these XML files directly. Once you have that schema file, the rest is pretty straightforward. Go back in here, exit, and what we do is we just export data. Log in. Question about, do the plugins get enabled automatically once import is complete? Yes. Yeah. So basically, Microsoft the tool handles disabling and re-enabling them after the export is done. Data.zip. So export. Now I've exported. You can see it generated this data.zip. What I'm doing is I'm just going to extract all, and we'll see what it actually generates. So we can see we've got this content types.xml. We've got the actual original schema file that's included as part of the package as well. So you'll see I got data schema, which is exactly the same as the schema that I used to export. But what is of most interest is this data.xml. Go into here. And this contains the actual record. So record with this ID, here are the fields, and you'd see all the different fields, as well as you can configure many-to-many relationships for that as well. So if there were any many-to-many relationships that you've exported, it will handle that. The configuration migration tool does a great job of worrying about the cyclical relationships. It basically imports all the records first and then does the relationships in a pass after that. The only other warning I'll give you about the configuration migration tool is there's a bit of an odd quirk where when you include a record type in your schema file, so let's say, for example, you have defined that, yes, you want to export page templates, but you only want to export the page templates that you've touched. So you put some filter in there, so it's only a couple new page templates that you've created. If you go and then import, as part of that same import, if you try and import web pages that refer to page templates that do exist in the target system but weren't included in your export, the import will fail. It won't actually relate those records together. So essentially, the way the tool works is that if the tool has in it, say, page templates, as it's adding records of other types, it will only refer to records that are part of that import process. It's I don't know if I'd call it a feature. I kind of feel like it's a bug that hopefully they'll fix at some point. But the key there is so if you're including web template or page templates, you also have to include the ones that other things as part of that same import refer to. Otherwise, the import won't proceed. So you can either do that, or you could say do two exports. You could do one export of just page templates, and then you could do another export of web pages that doesn't include page templates, in which case it will then just refer to the kind of the real database for those IDs. So if you include a table in your export and you have other records that point to those types of records, just be careful that you may run into a place where you're like, the tool will say, oh, that record didn't exist. And you're like, but it did exist. Here it is right here. Here's the ID. It's because it didn't exist as part of that actual data file. Okay, checking the questions. Do the plugin. Yeah, so I already answered. No more questions right now. Are the GUIDs of the out-of-the-box records the same across all environments? Yes. So Microsoft actually uses essentially this process when it installs the portals in your environment. So they install the solutions, and then they use basically an export of the configuration migration tool to import those records into your database. So the IDs are consistent across the environments. So whatever the ID is for the starter portal in your dev environment will be the same everywhere because you will have installed it across, which is the reason, as an aside, which is the reason why you can only install one of each type of portal into each environment, because otherwise you're trying to, say if you install the starter portal twice, you'll try to install another portal with the same ID. So there's kind of some known workarounds for that, but that's the main challenge right now with having, say, two customer self-service portals in the same environment. You'll have conflicting GUIDs on those. And then, as I mentioned, what we do is we take this schema file, we unpack it, and that's what we're checking into source control. We have code that kind of goes through there. We extract out into individual record types. We basically take this, what in most cases a giant XML file, and unpack it. And we even say extract, say, the web template code into its own file so that we can properly review it as part of our pull request. So we have some PowerShell scripts that basically go through that and explode out the zip file so that within source control, we have all these kind of individual files that we can keep an eye on. Okay. How much time we got here? Okay. Package deployer. So package deployer is kind of a wrapper on top of like moving solutions. The tool you can move these things across, including moving configuration migration utility data. So if you have this thing exported, you can include as part of a larger package the solutions and the configuration migration tool. So for example, this is what was used in the portal source code release, the XRM Portals Community Edition. They included some data as part of theirs. So if you export using the configuration migration tool, you can then use package deployer to move it across. So it's another option for deploying any sort of changes to upstream environments if you're already using package deployer. Right, Power App CLI. So the Power App command line interface now includes portal commands. So this is relatively new in the last few months. You have the ability to list the portals. You can download and upload. Now, I'll be the first to admit I'm not the expert on this. I've played with it a little bit. I've done some demos in my community calls, but it's not something that we have kind of dived into yet. We're still using the configuration migration tool. But essentially, you can download the content related to your portal. You can then work on it, say, in Visual VS Code, and then what you can do is upload it back. So I'll kind of show you an example of that. As Arpit mentioned, there are some tools that allow you to there's some extensions that make it an even nicer experience within Visual Studio Code. But if I just kind of look at this right here, what I'm going to do is I'm going to do this right here. So I'm going to do the PA portal download. Now I've pointed this at my environment, and all I have to do is really give it the ID of my portal. If I go back to here, we'll see in here that I've got this folder is currently empty. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to run this tool. You can see what it's doing is it's actually connecting, and it's getting all these records. Waiting for it to download, update manifest, and you can see now I've got this starter portal here that has a bunch of my data. So if I go back to here and look at what's in there, starter portal, I can say look at my web pages. I can say look at my home page, my content, and in here I've actually got the copy section or the summary. So this has the different data in there. We've got basically we're using YAML to store that. So instead of XML, we're using YAML. But the idea is the Power Apps command line interface. You can use, you can obviously script it. You can do it within your Azure DevOps pipelines or whatever other sort of build pipelines you want to use. So you can use this to import and export. Again, one of the reasons that I'm not fully kind of diving into this yet is my desire to kind of keep things as minimal as possible. I don't know, as far as I know, you can't do any filtering to say, oh, I only want to get certain things. Like, again, this is pulling down polls. Yeah, like we never use polls. I don't want polls in my source control. So yeah, I could probably filter them out, create a tool, but I don't know yet if there's any options to say, hey, I don't want to download those polls. If they start introducing things like that, then I think that would be great. But the idea here is that I can, let's just go into a home page. What page is here? And I'm going to look at my home page copy. I'm going to say Portals Bootcamp. Now you're able to edit a bunch of things directly in VS Code. I'm just going to save this. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to do the upload. So I just have to say PA portal upload and tell it where the location of my portal is. Hit enter. And what that does is it uploads this. And if I were to go back to my portal, which is right here, if I go back to my portal and I go into web pages, and if I were to look at my home page and open up the content, this will say Portals Bootcamp now. So a pretty nice interface. I mean, we're using Visual Studio Code all the time to do a lot of our work. So it's a nice interface for editing these things in there, saving it, and uploading it back. So you can imagine that even if you're not editing it, you can use this tool to export, check all of this thing into source control. And so what I like about this is that all that unpacking work that we've done kind of internally, where we just have scripts that unpack it, it's kind of automatically unpacked. So this is great for checking into source control. I'm hoping they give me some options to include or to exclude things that I maybe don't care about so much, as well as include more tables that maybe aren't out of the box. Because again, there's often other types of entities that we're including as part of our deployment process that then we might have to resort to using configuration migration tool as well. So it's like, do I want to use this and the other one, or do I just handle everything with that other one? So, but this is like almost brand new. It came out kind of over the summer. So I'm sure they're working on it. And yeah, this is what I would say is probably the future. And so I expect at some point that this will become kind of the de facto standard on how to do these things. Okay, just quickly finishing up here. So last option, as always, if you want to reinvent the wheel, or for whatever reason the other tools don't meet your needs, you can use custom code using the CDS or Dataverse APIs. Just calling in there, creating records, moving records. You know, you can write your own code if you want. I don't know if that's necessary, but it is an option, I guess. Just some of the challenges that we've run into here, just quickly at the end. So if you want a true ALM process, there are no APIs to refresh the cache. There's no APIs to provision a portal. So you can't, you know, some people's ALM process involves like, hey, we just spin up a brand new environment from scratch and we want to kind of test it out from scratch. You can't install a portal yet. That I believe, I think they're working on it. I hope they're working on it. I think they might have included that in the release notes. I can't remember, but I think that is kind of an end goal where long term you should be able to just provision a portal via code. So right now you can't do that. Another one of the challenges is just separating content versus config record. So if you're exporting all web pages from dev and importing those into upstream environments, well, what happens to people who've made some, you know, changes some titles or changed some basic web page copy? Unless you're doing that in dev every single time and pushing that up to your other environments, you can't. It's difficult to separate what is content versus your configuration. Another tough one is just handling if records need to be deleted, because a lot of these processes are about adding or updating records and not deleting. So if you need to delete some things, often that's kind of a manual process after the end. And finally, it's just important to remember, unfortunately, there is no easy button. No matter what you do, it's probably going to require some sort of investment. So you just have to look at your project and determine, you know, what's the ROI for smaller projects. Maybe the portals record mover in the XRM toolbox is good enough. Or do you need to have some sort of automated deployment using Azure DevOps, all that sort of stuff. So, yeah. So, just quickly, some other resources. There's a blog post from Nick Dolman about basically kind of a simple ALM for portals. There's a Refresh the Cache episode with Eugene about talking about Power Apps Portals ALM. Eugene built a very sophisticated ALM process. So if you're interested, you can listen to that. And the Portals community calls, I should have maybe mentioned. Every month I do a call, a monthly call. That's an hour. I pick whatever random topic. I think we just did it last Thursday. So it's typically like the last or second last Thursday of the month. So I've done a couple calls on ALM. Covering some of this content, but kind of did a deeper dive into the configuration migration tool as well. So if you're interested in watching those are available on the YouTube channel. All right, we've got about 3 minutes here. I see a question. Use deployment profile. The deployment profile switch allows you to define a set of variables for the environment in YAML format. For example, you can have different deployment profiles, such as dev, test, and prods, that have different schema. Okay. Looks like have they given us the ability to? Yeah, I'll have to take a look to see if they've added the support for custom tables. Yeah, it says custom tables and portal specific tables such as block community are not supported for customization using the Power Apps CLI. Yeah, so they do have a list of tables that they support. Just looking at the link here. Oh yeah, and then you can have deployment profiles for different environments. So, yeah. So again, I think this is something that Microsoft is going to continue to improve in the command line CLI. I suspect that that's where their investments are going to be moving forward. As it sits today, again, we're still using the configuration migration tool because there are some things. You know, it's hard to switch when the process is working fairly well, but I suspect long term that's where we'll end up going as well. So, Leap talked about deployment profiles yesterday. Okay, great. Maybe I'll have to see if I can get that session on a recording. Okay, was there any other questions? I know we've got only 1 minute here, and I'm sure there's another presentation. So
I
thank
think
you
you've
again,
covered
everyone,
them.
for attending today. Hope you learned something. And if you have any follow-up questions, reach out to me on social.
Thank you, Nick. You've covered all the questions. You managed to get hold of all of them as you went through. So that was absolutely brilliant. Thank you. And thanks for that really comprehensive look at all the tools that are available to us for Portals ALM. That was so helpful. Okay. If I could just ask you to maybe pop your contact details into the chat for people to get hold of, that would be fantastic.
Sure. Yeah, I will do that.